Okay, mute button's off. Welcome. That's Bill Donahue with Discerning Truth. And that's my good friend, the blind song leader, Michael Beatty. No, he's not really blind. He used to wear dark glasses all the time, and people started thinking he was a blind singer-songwriter. And yeah, I'm here. I'm here and not quite muted anymore. But thank you for joining me. I broadcast, well, let's just get that out of the way right off the bat. I broadcast on all these platforms, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, noon Pacific time. Donahue Papa on most places. On Pilled or Foxhole, I am Bill Donahue. And then YouTube gave me the name Discerning Truth 534, right? Monday and Wednesday, I teach through a book of the Bible. Typically, I just finished Galatians. We're going to start First and Second Corinthians, that I half-jokingly call First and Second Californians, because there's a lot of similarities to churches I'm familiar with in California in these letters. And then on Friday, I try to touch subjects that are I don't think you're going to be taught in church. I don't think you'll be taught the way I teach these books of the Bible Monday and Wednesday in most churches, but almost certainly you're not going to hear the stuff I talk about on Friday taught in church. I just went through some bumper sticker theology in the last couple Fridays, and things that people say and they believe it's part of the Bible, but some of it is exactly opposite of what's there. On Tuesdays, I'm usually on with Neo on her stream. Ron's in town, so Neo has been off, and they just did a Patriot meetup, so we didn't meet last week. Felt like going through withdrawals, having a week without morning rocks, but she says we're going to talk tomorrow. She still hasn't decided what the subject matter is going to be. There's a million things to talk about, and but you just check out Neo on her stream, and I hopefully we'll see you over there tomorrow. And then if you're inclined to write me a letter or send a card, or you're one of the people that likes to help my book buying addiction by sending books, you can mail them via snail mail to the Lahui address. Just make sure you include the suite 1300 and the number 164 on there. That's actually the way they address a private mailbox here. And but if you just have a question or a comment, email is the best way to get a hold of me, bill@discerningtruths.com. Almost every platform I'm on has DM ability, including Truth Social and that. And people will DM me, and I may not see your message for a couple days. If you email me, I'll get it right away. I started on CloutHub, and all my replays are there. CloutHub's really been struggling lately, trying to keep chat working. They still have 2 versions of the stream to go out. You got to actually work at finding the stream where you can chat. Search for either Donahue Papa or channel 217. Find that channel, click on it, and then enter the stream that way, and there's chat on CloutHub. It's very cumbersome. Hopefully they'll get it fixed up, but right now it is the one platform where all my replays are there and available. Starting to get them up on Rumble and YouTube, but I broadcast for more than a year before I was on either one of those 2 channels. And then after the stream, I take anything I put up on stream and create a PDF and post it on Discerning Truth groups. It's got all my scripture references and whatever. I'm a horrible typist, and I don't do well proofreading my own stuff until I'm on the air. So a lot of times I will take the screens that you see, correct the errors, and then save the PDF. If you're inclined to support what I do, or you just want to let me know you're a real person and not a bot, I do have a way on brandarmy.com under Donahue Papa. I like the Brand Army format because it's I like that army theme, because we are really equipping an army of saints to throw down every thought and idea that's exalted against God. And we're not in a warfare yet that's going to be fought with guns and bullets, but we are definitely in a spiritual warfare for the hearts and minds of people. And I like that army theme to keep us in that motif that we are actually fighting against principalities and powers in this world. I start my day every day with Miguel Fornia, Michael Beatty, my longtime friend. Michael and I have been friends for decades, and I met him as a worship leader, but God has really just expanded his gifts, turned him into a pretty awesome Bible teacher. And I get up in the morning, have my coffee, and listen to some worship music, proverb of the day, and then Michael is in Matthew right now, a great thing. And then on Sunday, his wife Linda joins him, and they're going through the Psalms. So I highly recommend that to you if you want to start your day that way. And we are in 1 Corinthians, and I'm doing an introduction. I always do an introduction to the book anytime I join a book or a letter. In this case, they're letters. And I try to give you the 5 W's that you learn in school: the who, what, when, where, and why. There's an H that of the how that is not applicable here for a lot of our studies, but I break it down. And like the first W, the who, I mean, who wrote it, and who did he write to? Who were the intended listeners? You know, the what. What's the content of the book or letter about? What is the general themes, right? The when, that's pretty self-explanatory. When was it written? And because the date can matter to when something was written. For example, when we're in Revelation, if you want to argue that Revelation was fulfilled in 70 AD, you have to have it written before 70 AD because it's prophecy, okay? If it wasn't written until the 90s AD, your argument that it was fulfilled in 70 AD falls on its face, right? So when it's written really matters. And then there are 2 aspects to the where question. Where was the writer? In this case, it's going to be Paul. There's no secret Paul wrote Corinthians, right? Where was he when he wrote this? What's the context of where he's at? And where is he writing to? Where is Corinth, right? You know, I mean, I jokingly call it California. You know, is it near California? Where is Corinth? And when you go to questions in your life, I always tell people, start with the why questions. Why are you doing this? Why do you believe this? Why are you whatever? And the other questions will answer themselves. But when you're looking at literature, you can't start with the why question. But what you find is that when you examine the other 4 W's, you often find the answer to the why question. You know, why is it, why did Paul write this letter? So with that, I'm going to start with the who question, and I've already told you the answer to the first part of it. The Apostle Paul wrote this letter. Now, he may not have penned it himself. He used, a lot of the biblical writers used what are called amanuensis. They're like a scribe. And they don't take word-for-word dictation like we think of a secretary today, but they listen to the teacher. He tells them what he wants is included in a letter, and they write it down, but their own words are included in the letter. We find, like the Apostle Peter gave verbal speeches, verbal testimonies of the gospel, and John Mark wrote that down in the Gospel of Mark. And, you know, Paul used several scribes, Luke very often, to write for him. So Luke and Acts are actually, Luke isn't an original apostle. He's writing under the authority of Acts. It is possible that Luke or Apollos or some other person that we're not familiar with from history wrote Hebrews for Paul. But like Luke uses some words that are not found in any other ancient Greek author, not even anything else Paul wrote. That's an extraordinary vocabulary when you're using words that nobody else has used. And then the writer of Hebrews shows an extraordinary education in Greek rhetoric and how it's done, and the way the structure of Hebrews is set up, that Paul doesn't show in his other letters. That may indicate that the author, the person that penned it for him, had that education rather than Paul in the Greek rhetoric. Okay? Not that Paul wasn't educated, but that they had a more refined education in that aspect. But the second who question here is rarely discussed by preachers. Who were the Corinthians? And you go, when you look at a map and you go, well, Corinth is like 55 miles from Athens. They're Greeks. Of course they're Greeks. The problem was that in about 146 BC, the Romans conquered Corinth. And they killed every man. And they sold every woman and child into slavery. Who's that leave left? The conquering army. And for the next 100 years, the devastation was so great that Corinth was basically farmland. A strategic location. Had 2 ports. It was very strategic for trade. Did not develop for another 100 years. And then finally, Julius Caesar rebuilds the city as a Roman colony. Okay? Now, you're going, wait a second. What's this Roman colony doing in the middle of Corinth? They had Roman colonies all over the place. There were Roman colonies in Judea. There were Roman colonies all over. But what you're going to have is this colony is set up. And I have a map later. I'm going to show you how Greece is divided, and Corinth comes into a very critical place for the trade routes. And it had a port on each side of the city and a very narrow isthmus between them. I mean, at the narrowest point, it's about 4 miles across, where they could drag boats on, small boats on logs and stuff, and cut off a significant amount of ocean journey by cutting them across the harbor, or take cargo off at one side and reload it on the other side, right? Now understand, Julius Caesar's not a fool. He knows that Corinth was a wealthy and important trade port for the Grecian Empire, Macedonian Empire, and Alexander the Great time that it was there. And he knows when he rebuilds it, that it is immediately going to become an important political, economic, and military point. You'd have to be a fool not to realize that. So what politicians do, they have always done. You want to control and make sure that port stays loyal to you. You put your cronies in there, people you can trust, make them very wealthy off of the trade that's coming through there. And who are they going to be loyal to? The person that buttered their bread. They're going to be loyal to Julius Caesar. So that's what happens. So what you have is Julius Caesar creating a Roman colony, basically doing a master plan community on how it was going to be set up, hand picking who was going to be in there and controlling the trade, and it's there. So what this kind of economy does, Corinth, because there's so much trade, you're also going to need a lot of heavy laborers, people that carry a lot of stuff. Well, the Roman Empire had slaves for that. So you would have had a huge number of slaves working in Corinth, moving all the cargo. And what you have is an economy where you have the very rich and the very poor, and very few in the middle class. Maybe some shopkeepers and stuff that were doing stuff would have been middle class, but you would have had just extraordinary wealth and extraordinary poverty in the same city. And there clearly were enough Jews in Corinth for it to need a synagogue, and Paul stayed with some Jews there. But we don't know, it wasn't by any means a Jewish city. And even it's part of historic Greece, so there would have likely been a lot of Greeks living there. But it is a Roman colony, and that's what we need to remember, because it's going to help us answer some other questions. Why, what Paul's doing with this Roman colony and why he chose it. So, like I said, the first 2 questions is easy. Paul's the author, right? But the what question is, what do you call it? A laundry list of problems in this city. Paul starts with a typical introduction and greeting that he does in most of his letters. And then he addresses the root problem. And the root problem in Corinth is divisions within the body of Christ. Okay? He's going to touch on it in 1 Corinthians 1:10 to 4:21. The first 3 chapters are going to deal with laying down the issue of the root divisions. And then Paul's going to shift to some specific examples of divisions within the body, starting with the lack of spiritual discipline in the church. You know, they have a guy sleeping with his father's wife, and they're bragging about how tolerant they are, right? You know, they're boasting in that sin. The next issue that's causing division is related to the Christians suing each other, their fellow Christians. Oh, we divide over anything. These people were actually taking each other to court, right? And the next issue causing divisions was the lack of purity, the lack of moral purity in the church. Because, and like I said, I'll talk to you a little bit about the rise of Gnostic ideas and the idea that the material world is evil and whatever you do in the body doesn't matter as long as you're sinless in your spirit, and the spirit can't sin. These Gnostic ideas were developing in the first century. They actually were carryovers from Jewish Gnosticism prior to the first century, but they developed. Even though Gnosticism doesn't officially be recognized by historians until the second century, the ideas are clearly here in the first century, and Paul is dealing with them. And then the next issue, they have questions about marriage and divorce and celibacy and all these things that have to do with the marriage relationship. And then the next issue dividing the church has to do with, and Paul's going to intermingle his teaching on the Lord's Supper and teachings against eating food sacrificed to idols, right? And kind of, he goes back and forth. They all tie together, and they're all causing divisions in the church. And then there were even divisions on the proper way to have worship, including the use of spiritual gifts. I mean, the spiritual gifts were very prevalent in Corinth, but it was like they were totally out of control. And they even had disputes on how they should love each other. You know, I mean, seriously, this is what we're going to divide over? And then how Paul ends up in 1 Corinthians 15 is he takes them back to the very basics, the core Christian doctrines, and said, this is what you unite around. Quit dividing over this other stuff. This is the heart and basic. I want to know nothing other than Christ and Christ crucified, right? And you do it. And then the letter ends with his regular conclusion and salutation. That's Paul's typical way of writing a letter. And then, but from the letters in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, we can infer that Paul wrote a total of 4 letters. In 1 Corinthians 5:9, he mentions a previous letter. So this is this 1 Corinthians is actually the second letter, right? Then it is followed by, he talks about a fearful and severe visit and a letter associated with that in 2 Corinthians 2:3-4. That visit is not recorded in Acts. It's not talked about. We don't have the letter. And then finally we have the letter known as 2 Corinthians. So he wrote a total of 4, at least 4 letters to this church, only which 1st and 2nd Corinthians have survived to today, right? The next question is, when was 1 Corinthians written? And so I'm going to tell you, you're always going to end up in the 80-50s, okay? No matter who you talk to, you're going to be here. But you're going to see some dates that are very early, like 80-53 to 55. Or late 80-56 to 59. And you go, well, why are they debating this issue? And I'm going to take a minute just to explain to you why you get into trouble when you try to date this. Everybody agrees that the founding of the church at Corinth is described in Acts 18:1-17. And during that visit, Paul stays with Aquila and Priscilla, who had returned to Corinth when the Jews were expelled from Rome. And you see that in Acts 18:1-2. The edict of Claudius that expelled the Jews from Rome happened in AD 49. So the earliest date that you can have for this letter is AD 49, right? Can't go any earlier than that. And both of these dates are well after that. But he also mentions that Galileo was a proconsul of Achaia. This is the section of Greece that is divided from the rest of Greece, and you got to go through Corinth to get to, in Acts 18:12. And history tells us that he was proconsul of Achaia from the second half of AD 51 to the first half of AD 52. Well, now I got a very narrow window. If he was proconsul when Paul founded the church, Paul has to find Corinth in that period, AD 51 to AD 52. Okay? Now that we laid down when Acts 18 happened, it's after AD 49, but it has to be AD 51 and 52. Then we go and look and we find out that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians during his third missionary journey, and he was near the end of that 3-year ministry in Ephesus on that journey. And that's from Acts 19, 21 and 22. Because he's talking about he's planning on leaving Ephesus and he's going to go through Macedonia and come down to them. So he can't be writing it when he just got to Ephesus. It's got to be near the time he's leaving Ephesus. So now you start backdating. You go, okay, I got a 3-year stay in Ephesus. I got the third missionary journey, the second missionary journey, the first missionary journey. I got Paul's conversion, the 3 years in the desert, and you start adding up these years, and you go, wait a second, I got a problem. Because, if we go and we're saying that you're going to put this letter in the first half of AD 52, that's a problem. But if it's his visit that's in the first half of AD 52, right? Then this letter is at least 3 years later. Then you're looking at closer to 55 and maybe the 56 to 59, okay? You're going to be having a hard time fitting it into 53 and still fitting a 3-year visit into there if he only founded the church in AD 51 or 52, right? So this puts a monkey wrench into most timelines because a lot of people think, and I was one of them, I held very strongly to the position that Jesus was crucified in AD 33. Paul's conversion AD 34, and the timeline seemed to fit. I held to this for many, many years. And then, but you have a problem with that beginning date. If he is founding the church in Corinth in AD 50 and 51 to 52, because then the letter has to be after 55, and you don't have enough years to fit in there. And like I said, for many years I was confident in that date, but I kept running into scholars, a lot of scholars that were arguing for crucifixion in AD 30 and Paul's conversion in 31, right? Or even late in AD 30, possibly months after the crucifixion. And if that happened, and Paul received the gospel from Jesus, it happened either mere months after the crucifixion and absolutely within 5 years. And this gets to be an important issue for us later. But it's going to determine whether you're thinking this letter is AD 53 to 55 or 56 to 59. If you are trying to put the passion in AD 33, you're definitely putting this out in the 56, 59 date. Maybe closer to AD 58 and 59. And if you're going to hold it at AD 30 date, you might be able to get as early as AD 55. I don't see any way to get to AD 53 and fit everything in there. And that's if the 3 years that Paul is in Achaia in Arabia are included in the 14 years before he goes back to Jerusalem. If that's a total of 14 years, and it's 14 years from his conversion, and inclusive of the 3 years, then you can make it fit. If you add it together and make it a 17-year total span, there's no way you're going to fit this in here, okay? So the question comes up, where was Paul when he wrote, and where is Corinth, okay? And like I said, you're going to I just kind of tipped my hand that Paul was in Ephesus. And the reason we know this is that there's hints in the book that he talks about, that he, in 1 Corinthians 16:19, in the end, in the salutation, he tells them that he is going to visit them after passing through Macedonia. And then it seems to indicate that Paul was in Ephesus and didn't plan to leave Ephesus until after Pentecost. We also know that on his third missionary journey that Paul stayed in Ephesus for 3 years, okay? And that he moved up through Macedonia and down through Corinth on his third missionary journey. So that pretty much lands, Paul has to be on his third missionary journey, and very likely, almost certainly, in Ephesus when he writes this. Now, but the other more interesting question is, where is Corinth? And like I said, Corinth is located on a narrow isthmus that's like a skinny neck of land between two landmasses, right? It has a seaport on either side, and it connects Greece with the Peloponnese region of Greece, this other section of Greece. Back in the time of Paul, it was known as the Roman province of Achaia. It has two seaports, one on the east and the other on the west. And one of the seaports in Corinth is known as Cenchrea, okay? And then you may see it written down with the K spelling, Kenchries or EES, but it's Cenchrea. Now this is a suburb, a community within Corinth. This is where Phoebe, the female deaconess that Paul gives his letter to the Romans, comes from, Cenchrea. Okay? Now, this may be helpful if we understand that this is a Roman colony and he's sending a letter to a Roman church. Sending a Roman carrying a letter makes a lot of sense. Now, the map I had here didn't have Ephesus labeled. It just had all the paths intersecting in Ephesus, so I added in red where Ephesus is. And it definitely is right there. And you can see Paul went through Ephesus regularly. But on his third missionary journey, he goes up and around and then back down to Corinth on the other side, and going through Macedonia. So this is how we do this. Now, I didn't blow this up, but you can see there's a very narrow bridge. It almost looks like the bottom section where it says Corinth on the map, that almost looks like an island. There's actually a very narrow strip of land connecting it to the main part of Greece. And so this is Corinth, and this is why this is an important letter. And then we get to the most important question. Why did Paul write to Corinth, right? And like I said, he's dealing with divisions. They're factionalizing behind rival leaders in the church. They have open sexuality celebrated in the church. There's lawsuits going on between fellow Christians. They're engaging in prostitution. Some people are arguing that you should engage in celibacy in marriage. You got the wild, sex crazed people on one side, and the super strict, only sex for marriage, only sex to produce children level, right? And Christians married to one another asking for divorce, and Christians married to pagans asking about divorce, and disputes surrounding marriage and remarriage and idolatry, and concerns about women praying and prophesying in immodest ways, and chaos in worship with speaking in tongues and competing voices with the sermon. You have inequality at the Last Supper, right? You got disputes over the bodily resurrection of Christ and the future resurrection going on in this church. And they even had a dispute over how to handle the collection of money to be sent to Jerusalem, the poor in Jerusalem. And this is because, as I told you in another study, a famine had hit in that area of Judea. And even though the famine was over by the date of this writing, the effects of that famine were not over, and they were still collecting money around the empire to help the poor in Jerusalem. And this you see in Acts 15. Okay? This amount of mess, this amount of crap going on in the Corinthian church caused Paul to change his travel plans and go to Corinth. Okay? And this is why he's writing to them. Like, I left, you can almost see Paul slapping his head. I swear to God, I left you guys there not long ago. I told you all this stuff. Why are we doing this again? Why am I going over the same issues with you time and time again? And as I explained, in the economic, political, and cultural makeup of Corinth made it ripe for factions and divisions. For whatever reason, they also embraced all the experiences of the gifts of the Holy Spirit while simultaneously being very lax when it came to orthodoxy, correctness in doctrine and practice. That was less important to them than experiencing Christianity, the experienced Christianity. Try Jesus, he'll fix your life, whatever. They were into experience instead of right beliefs and right practice. And now, like I said, Paul seems to have written a total of 4 letters to Corinth. He also made at least 3 visits to Corinth. Paul's first visit to Corinth is at the founding of the church, Acts 18, 1-18. Sometime later, he may have made another visit to Corinth, which is foreshadowed in 1 Corinthians 4:19 and 16:5-8. It is often described as his painful visit because of Paul's later comment in 2 Corinthians 2:1. His third visit is mentioned in 2 Corinthians 12:14 and 13:1, right? And described briefly in Acts 20 verses 2 and 3. And it's possible after Paul's release from house arrest at the end of the book of Acts. It doesn't say he's released, but we know he was released because he went places after on another missionary journey that are not recorded in the book of Acts. He may have gone to Corinth. We don't know if he did or not, but we have at least 3 visits and 4 letters to one church. That's a problem church, right? And then clearly the church at Corinth required a lot of correction from Paul. And these 2 letters have survived, are just part of his attempts to bring a church back into alignment with orthodox doctrines and practices, and to help them unify around the essential doctrines of the faith. And if you're new here and have never seen a chart, a friend of mine, Michael Patton, of a ministry called Credo House, created this bullseye, and I use it more than Michael does. There's a very limited number of doctrines that you must believe to be saved. And I use the thief on the cross as my way of deciding which those doctrines are, because Jesus promised that thief he was saved. Okay? He clearly was believing in the God of the Bible. He knew he was a sinner. He knew he couldn't save himself. He believed Jesus could intervene on his behalf, and he asked Jesus to do it. That's the gospel in a nutshell. And it was sufficient to save the thief on the cross. There is no evidence the thief on the cross believed in the Trinity, the virgin birth, a lot of other doctrines we consider essential for Christianity, but he had beliefs that were essential for salvation. When we start talking about things like the Trinity and the virgin birth and that, you're in things that all Christians in all sects have believed to be considered orthodox, whether you're Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, Baptist, Evangelical, whatever you are, you're non-denominational. There's certain doctrines we all agree. If people are like deny the Trinity and they're oneness Pentecostal or they're somebody else, they step outside of that. If they claim that Jesus is not, what do you call it? He was a created being, and he's like the Jehovah's Witness. They are outside of historic orthodoxy, right? They may or may not be saved, but they're not considered orthodox in their thing. When we get out to traditional orthodoxy, we're talking about things that were decided by the early church councils and over disputes in the church. The refutation of Gnosticism, the idea that Jesus has two natures, a divine nature and a human nature that didn't intermingle, but they both existed in Jesus, that he was always the Son of God. He didn't become the Son of God at his baptism. And that gets into things like when you hear people talk about Mary being Mary, the mother of God, and we all go, oh, the Catholics are crazy. What that doctrine said in the early church in these fights was that Jesus was God while he was in the womb of Mary. He didn't become God or didn't get the God particle or the God spirit didn't fall on him at some later date. He was always God. It's not about who Mary was, it's about who Jesus was. And that was the dispute at the time. That's all things for traditional Orthodoxy. So the Oriental Orthodox Church, most famous branch of that we would know would be Coptics out of Egypt, hold that Jesus only has one nature, that the divine and human came together as one new nature. And they divide with the rest of Christianity at the third circle out. They are my brothers and sisters in Christ, but they are not traditionally Orthodox Christians. See the difference? I have no doubt in their salvation if they're trusting in Jesus for their salvation, but they don't fit in traditional Christian Orthodoxy. When we get to denominational Orthodoxy, we're talking about you want to believe certain things to be Baptist or Presbyterian or Catholic or Orthodox or whatever. You can have certain denominational distinctions. And then we get doctrines that are important but not essential, right? I mean, we talk about it, how does free will and predestination come together? Those are important doctrines, but they're not essential. Which side you fall down on that does not determine your salvation. Then we have not important. I don't like the title not important. That's the one thing I would say less important. Okay? Do you believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, or do you think Jesus is coming back at the end of the tribulation? Those are less important doctrines. They don't matter for your salvation. They don't. I got mad when I went to Calvary Chapel because they made the belief in a pre-tribulation rapture part of their statement of faith. And I thought it was taking something in the outer circle and moving it too close to the center. But Calvary I did a lot of great things, and I enjoyed my time at Calvary. I have a lot of brothers and sisters there. I'm not putting down the thing. It was just an issue I had while I was there. We got to keep our perspective. This Corinthian church is out in the spiritual gifts, and fighting over those and things and doctrines that are not essential for any of these core beliefs, and they're dividing over them. And that's the same thing I see in the church today. And like I said, because I'm from California, I went there when I was 8. I essentially lived most of my life in California. I've seen a lot of this in churches in California, and that's why I call it first and second Californians. But I'm sure if you live in Virginia or Texas or some other state, you're going to see churches this will apply to there as well. So I'm going to put a song on. If you're new here, I don't usually interact with the chat until I'm done through the lesson, and then I put a video on. I will read the chat and see if there's any questions I can answer right away, and if there's not questions, I will end up closing early. But if there are questions, I'll address them when I come back.
Behold, bless ye the Lord, all ye servants of the Lord Most High.
Okay, I'm back and unmuted, hog. There we are. So, yeah, I didn't see a lot of questions. I do see singing pretties in my chat, and I just wanted to it reminded me of something. I like her music selection, okay, and I think she does a great job. Except for Metal Monday is not my cup of tea, but a lot of her music selection. So when I'm doing my studies in the afternoon, a lot of times what I will do is put on her as my stream, and I just let her know I'm there. I had somebody comment to me in her chain, and I wasn't looking at it, and they thought I was ignoring them. I just want you to understand that if you see me comment in her chat, it may be my one comment, and then I'm back to what I'm doing. I just she's my favorite radio station on there, and it's the only place I'm ever going to hear a Bob Bennett song. So we're both kind of Bob Bennett fans, and if you've never heard "A Man in the Tombs," it's a very touching song. But that's my musical taste, and your opinions may vary, right? And then. Yeah, I just think that First and Second Corinthians are going to be relevant to us because we have a lot of excesses going on in the charismatic community today. We have a lot of divisions in the church today, and that a lot of this is going to hit home. And I think that you're also going to see when I deal with this, and I did a little bit with Neil a couple weeks ago, on the Lord's Supper and how Paul addresses it there and how he ties it to the eating or compares and contrasts it to eating food sacrificed to idols. It'll give you a better appreciation for what's going on at the Lord's Supper and exactly what Paul's saying about not discerning the body. Okay? And we do that. So my daughter's flying in and I got to get to the airport. So I am going to just land this plane and get out of here for today. And God bless you all for listening. Don't forget, share it with your friends. And we will, hopefully, I'll see you tomorrow over at Neo's. Right? Thank you.
Found